Hey everybody, Andy Kvernen with today's Cornerstone Connection Daily Devotional. Have you ever been in a situation where somebody made a claim that was so audacious, so out there, so totally outrageous, and yet they were sincere about it, that it made you laugh? It made you just want to kind of laugh in their face. I can remember when I was in high school, there was a guy on our football team, and he was a nice guy in many ways, and yet he had probably some sort of a complex where he needed to prove himself. And so one of the ways that he tried to do that was to make the claim that he was being recruited by the University of Oklahoma to play football. And he would look right in our face and say, yeah, I'm going to be a Division I football player. They're going to put me on scholarship and I'm going to the University of Oklahoma. And that might have been a sincere statement to reckon with, maybe something to listen to, except that we all knew that he was a very average player on our team. That there were guys that were a lot better than him that weren't even being recruited by Division II or Division III teams. And so the temptation was, when this guy on our football team made this kind of a claim, was to laugh in his face. It reminds me of a situation in the book of Genesis chapter 17, where God comes to Abraham and he's establishing with Abraham a promise, a covenant, and he's describing for Abraham all that Abraham can look forward to. And then he comes to a spot where it just sort of turns something over for Abraham, and Abraham loses it. I want you to watch what God says in Genesis chapter 17, verse 15. It says, God also said to Abraham, as for Sarah, your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarah. Her name will be Sarah. Sarai, Sarah, S-A-R-A-I to S-A-R-A-H. Okay? He's saying, I'm going to give her a new name. I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. Okay? Now, this might sound like a natural thing to happen for Abraham and Sarah to give birth to a child, and yet watch this. In verse 17, it says, Abraham fell face down, he laughed, and he said to himself, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? See, it turns out Abraham was pretty old by this time. I think it's fair to say, no matter how old we are, 100 is 100. 100 is fairly old. And most people don't have children when they're 100 years old. And then he says, will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? Certainly not a woman who's past the age of childbearing years, who's been through menopause, who's well advanced. She's 90 years old. She's not bearing a child anytime soon, at least from a human perspective. And Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing. In other words, if only the son that I already have by a different woman might have the blessing. But here's the thing, friends. That son wasn't a part of God's plan. And Abraham keeps trying to find a human solution. And when God says to him, look, I'm going to give you a supernatural solution, Abraham laughs in his face. Have you ever done that to God? Have you ever laughed in God's face? Maybe God has called you to go on a mission trip, like going to Guatemala here this summer. And the inclination is to say, God, there's no way I can do that. I can't get time off work. I can't afford that. I don't know where the funds would come from. It's scary to go to a place in kind of a second or third world environment. God, I'm not going to do that. And we sort of laugh in God's face. Maybe it's in witnessing to our friends or our neighbors. Maybe it's trusting God for a situation that we're dealing with, whatever it is. Friends, I think we've all been there at times where God puts something before us, and the temptation is to do what Abraham did, to laugh in his face. And yet, watch what happens here. In verse 19, God assures Abraham, it says, then God said, yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. And as for Ishmael, I've heard about your human solution. I'm not going to neglect Ishmael because of you. God says, I will surely bless him, and I'll make him fruitful, and will greatly increase his numbers. He'll be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation. But my covenant, my supernatural design for the world, for you, Abraham, for Sarah, for your family is this. He says, but my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year. When he had finished speaking with Abraham, God went up from him. Now, Abraham has a choice. He has a choice. He's laughed at God. He said, God, there's no way this could happen. And yet God doubles down. He says, no, it's going to happen. And watch what happens. You're going to have a son by next year, by Sarah. What does Abraham do? Verse 23, it says, on that very day, Abraham took his son Ishmael and all those born in his household or bought with his money, every male in his household, and circumcised them as God told him. And we could keep reading, but the point is this. Ultimately, though Abraham looked at God and said, no way, and he started to laugh, he ultimately took God at his word. He was circumcised. This is the covenant that God had given him, and he had his whole household circumcised. Abraham, in faith, trusted the Lord. Friend, you may have laughed at God at one point or another in your life, maybe even about something you're still considering. Let me challenge you. Bring that to God and listen to God. What is God telling you? What is God leading you to? And when God makes clear his revelation, stop laughing and start doing. And for Abraham, that meant being circumcised. Praise God, that's not a requirement today. But take God at his word and do what he's asked of you and watch what God will do. Friends, remember, it was through Abraham that the nations have been reached. It was through Abraham that you and I know Jesus today. God bless you, friends. Have a great day. And Lord willing, we'll see you again soon on the Cornerstone Connection.